Before I got into the PC Master Race, sorry, I have a bit of a cough, I hope you can excuse me. I used to game heavily on consoles, anywhere from the ATARI, all the way to the GameCube, to the PSP, and now the new generation of consoles. I loved having the ability of controlling your actions with a controller in your hand, but there are some consoles that actually went overlooked and rather unheard. Now the first few don't have a whole lot of information, but I do hope I can at least show you one console that you may have never heard of, and really spark some interesting entertainment. So with that being said, here are 23 consoles you most likely have never heard of. Hopefully. Alright, kicking it off with the first console to be released in 1972, it was the Odyssey. Now this was created by Magnavox, who followed it up with the Odyssey 100, and eventually they improved it with the version of the Odyssey 200. Now this was actually the first home console that allowed 4 players to play on it at a single time. Now that's pretty interesting. Next up, we have the TELSTAR. This console was produced by Coleco, and it actually started from the TELSTAR Pong, and later it developed into another 13 consoles that actually concluded the TELSTAR series of consoles, all of them collectively selling roughly over 1 million units. Now that's not too shabby. With number 21 on our list, we're looking at the FAIRCHILD Channel F. Now this console was released by Fairchild Semiconductor, who wanted their chance at the console industry sometime in November of 1976. This console offered the first programmable ROM cartridge, as well as it actually being the first console to use a microprocessor in it. And by 1977, it ended up selling over 250,000 units. Okay, so Universal Research Lab released their follow-up console to the Video Action console, calling it Video Action 3. Strangely enough, they actually never end up selling a Video Action 2, so I'm not really sure if the Video Action 2 was ever made and not decided to release it. I thought that was kind of strange, but quite interesting. In January of 1977, RCA released their Studio 2 console that delivered simple beeps and noises, as well as distinctively coming with 5 built-in games. The only thing is, it was rather obsolete at launch due to the success of the Fairchild F, and ended up being discontinued rather shortly. Again, another console in 1977, this time Nintendo introduced their Color TV game console. It was only sold in Japan, and it became produced into 4 following consoles, all collectively selling over 3 million units until it later being discontinued in 1980. With 1977 being a rather strong year for releases in video game consoles, Bally started manufacturing their ASTROCADE. This console was notable for their powerful graphics at the time of release. It was only briefly marketed before Bally exited the market, where it was sold to a third-party company. Now at the time, it costed $299. That is equivalent to $1,168 in today's terms. That is a very expensive console, if I have to say so. On New Year's Day of 1978, APF Electronics released their 8-bit cartridge console called the APF M1000. It featured a non-detachable joystick along with numeric keypads. The console also came along with a built-in game by the name of Rocket Patrol. It was a pretty cool game. And unfortunately, there were no other games that came strapped with it at the time of release. The INTELLIVISION. This was the console that was sold by Mattel Electronics, released in 1979 to only a certain US test market. It was eventually fully released to North America in 1980 and to Japan in 1982. Now this console had 125 games to be released for it, and it actually ended up selling over 3 million units. It was actually competitive with the Atari 2600 at the time, so there was still a little bit of competition with Atari, surprisingly. Nintendo developed and sold Game & Watch handheld electronic games, each of them featuring a single game, which later inspired the Game Boy. It featured a clock and an alarm built in. Now the Game & Watch garnered much of Nintendo's success in the console market, selling over 43 million units, which was much more than anything at the time. Coleco ended up following up their TELSTAR with the COLECOVISION. Now it offered strong and powerful arcade game systems, and it was actually also competitive with the Atari 2600. It included Donkey Kong in the first 12 games that were featured in the pack-in cartridge, along with Zaxxon and some others, eventually totaling 145 titles that were published for the ColecoVision. Eventually, it was discontinued, selling it in 1985, where Coleco pulled out of the gaming console industry as a whole. Honestly, you hate to see it, you really do. Next up, we have the VECTREX. It was released in November of 1982, and it was developed by Western Technologies. Now, it went through licensing of 2 different companies. This console had an integrated vector monitor that displayed vector graphics, unlike most of the other consoles that were actually being released at the time. Color was simulated by plastic screen overlays. It came with a built-in game, along with a light pen and a 3D imager. It didn't last that long, and ended up being discontinued in 1984. The Master System was released by Sega. It was a direct competitor to the NES in 1985 in Japan, 1986 in North America, 1987 in Europe, and 1989 in Brazil. That's a lot of different dates. It had significantly superior hardware compared to the NES. Unfortunately, it failed to properly market itself against the NES. Now, it did come with a couple of special accessories such as the light gun and the 3D glasses. Currently, to date, it is the longest living game console. I guess you can say it's the OG of the consoles. Next up, we have the Action Max console system. It was manufactured by Worlds of Wonder, and it was released in 1987. It was required that the user have a VCR due to not having a real way to play the VHS tapes. It did come along with a light gun, because the only reason for it was that the only genre of games on the system were light gun games, and ultimately it led to a rather short lifespan. Collectively developed by Hudson Soft and NEC, the TurboGrafx-16 was the first 16-bit console, yet still had an 8-bit CPU, quite strange, and it was released in Japan in 1987, 1989 in North America, and eventually a few months later in 1989, it showed up in France. Now, the console did rather poorly in North America, but it was extremely successful in Japan, and would later get 2 major revisions in 1989 and 1991. We have another handheld console, only this time it was Atari taking their shot at the handheld consoles. They called it the LYNX. It was released in October of 1989 in North America and 1990 in both Europe and Japan. Now, it was distinctively the first handheld console that had color LCD with advanced graphics and a rather ambidextrous layout. The LYNX competed with the Game Boy in the handheld market. The NEOGEO console was a cartridge-based arcade system that was released on April 26 of 1990 in Japan. While originally releasing as a coin-operated arcade machine, it's to this day that it is the most expensive console to ever release, and in December of 2012, the whole brand was actually revived, introducing the NEOGEO X handheld and home system console. You gotta love those arcade systems, you really do. The Dutch company, by the name of Royal Philips Electronics NV, developed the Philips CDI. It was created to provide a better functionality than what an audio CD player could, or even a game console, and at a significantly lower price than what a computer would sell for. The reason for its cheap cost was due to its no hard drive, no floppy drive, keyboard, monitor, and actually had less operating system software. It did include encyclopedias, museum tours, and much more for educational purposes along with the games. It was more than just a gaming console. Now, it was time for Hudson Soft and NEC to step up their console game, releasing their next one on October 10th of 1991 in North America. They called it the TURBODUO. It took a step up from the TurboGrafx-16, and it actually had an increase of RAM by 192 kilobytes, and they had an updated BIOS. But other than that, it was not that much greater than what the TurboGrafx-16 had offered. Pioneer released their LASERACTIVE in 1993. The console accepted Mega Drives, TurboGrafx-16 ROM cartridges, as well as CD-ROMs. And it also let the users have full freedom regionally with no regional lockouts. That allowed software from any region to play it on any system. That was a pretty crazy thing to hear back in those days. Getting down to our third to last console. This console was the first 32-bit console. It was named the AMIGA CD32. It was actually known as Spellbound, and no, I'm not talking about the upcoming game. Well, it is the same name, but you kind of know what I mean, alright? It was released on September 17 of 1993, and it was developed by Commodore. It was made possible to upgrade it enough to have the equivalence of what an Amiga 1200 computer had. It unfortunately did not last too long due to the unfortunate events of Commodore going into bankruptcy the following year. In 1993, Panasonic manufactured and took what EA and New Technologies Group were able to design and specify to release a 3DO interactive multiplayer console that was actually originally developed by the 3DO company. While I think you might be a little confused with that, and so am I, it was that the 3DO company was not manufacturing the console, they only developed it, and then later on EA and Panasonic were able to get their hands on it. At the time, it was very pricey, but it did deliver cutting edge technology, and sadly it only ended up lasting 3 years before it was discontinued. And last but not least, we have the Genesis Nomad. This was the handheld console that was made by Sega, and it was released exclusively in North America in October of 1995. This console offered a library of over 500 Genesis titles. Only problem is it didn't have any pack-ins for itself on release. Now, it was designed to have a video port that could be used with a TV set. That was pretty cool. Yet, like many that we have said before, it did have a short lifespan that ended up being discontinued within 4 years. Hopefully you enjoyed, and if you heard, owned, or played any of these consoles, then definitely let us know. But like I said, hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, stay interactive by subscribing or help by liking out. With that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.